We begin with a call for change in what has been part of Israeli policy for decades. Hundreds of retired Israeli security officials are making the case to end the war in Gaza, and they are urging U.S. President Trump to pressure their government to do so. The former officials say in a video that the fighting with Hamas has dragged on for political reasons, and that it now puts Israel's security and identity at risk. The conflict has lasted nearly 2 years. Israel has said 50 hostages are being held in Gaza, of whom around 20 are thought to still be alive. In an open letter, the retired officials wrote the following: "It is our professional judgment that Hamas no longer poses a strategic threat to Israel, and our experience tells us that Israel has all it takes to deal with its residual terror capabilities, remotely or otherwise. Chasing remaining senior Hamas operatives can be done later. Our hostages can't wait." One of those who signed that letter is Jeremy Issacharoff, a former ambassador of Israel to Germany and Vice Director General of the Foreign Ministry in Jerusalem. He explained what he considers to be the most important points of this letter.
I'm glad that you put the main emphasis on the fact that we need to release our hostages. If we want the war to end, it is absolutely critical that we do everything possible in the Israeli defense establishment to release the 50 hostages that are remaining in Gaza. Those that are alive, we estimate there are about 20 hostages still alive, and the rest are presumed dead. But one needs to come back to their families, and the others need to come back to their families for burial and a respectful closure. So that is the reason that we signed the letter. We think this is a critical opportunity to end the war and to put an end to this very tragic saga, which has deeply affected Israeli morale and is still a trauma that is continuing today within Israeli society.
Ambassador, I can assume that this was not an easy decision for anyone who signed the letter, and that it includes you. Tell me what went through your mind when you made the decision to sign this letter and to call for President Trump to put pressure on your very own government.
Well, it's because, again, that we felt that the war has gone on for too long. We've achieved very significant achievements over the last 2 years. We have shattered the leadership and capabilities of Hamas, of Hezbollah. We've rebuffed massive missile attacks from Iran, and also the regime in Syria has changed. And therefore, we're in a new strategic reality in which we could achieve and consolidate these gains by creating a political dynamic also with the Palestinians to put behind us this war. And again, I emphasize, to get back our hostages. This issue is by no means forgotten in Israel. It practically every day is an issue that we're not in a post-trauma situation. We are still in the trauma of our hostages being taken on the 7th of October. And that's why we've come to the conclusion we can use force up to a point, but at the end of the day, we need diplomacy in order to make sure there's a deal in one go to get all the hostages back. And we felt the central reason for the letter was that, number one, this was the right time to do it. And number two, President Trump has a tremendous amount of influence on the Israeli prime minister in a way that he would see this as serving Israel's national security interest and also the national security interest of America.
You say now is the right time to do this. Is that because all of the domestic attempts to influence Prime Minister Netanyahu, have they all failed?
Look, let's not forget one thing. We are dealing with a fanatical, brutal terrorist organization. And I wouldn't wish on on the worst times that anyone has to deal with this type of organization that didn't do this in order to bring about a Palestinian state, to bring about some political process between Israel and the Palestinians. They did it to destroy any chance of peace and ultimately to have a one-state solution, which is Palestine instead of Israel. And I must say, that I would really believe that it's about time that, when we talk in the West and we hear in the West of governments saying they're going to recognize the Palestinian state, if they want this war to end, again, at the risk of overemphasis, they should also put pressure on our Arab neighbors that can pressure Hamas to do everything they can to get these hostages out. As long as these hostages are in Gaza, we'll have an unstable situation. And there are a lot of Israelis that still want to have a political process with the Palestinians. And it's really important that our friends in Europe, particularly also in Germany, who I believe continue to understand the difficulties and the dilemmas that we face, their support is still very critical.
Ambassador, the announcements coming from the UK, France, and Canada that they would be prepared to recognize Palestinian statehood, how much pressure or did it trigger the decision to publish this letter?
No, I speak for myself. I'm not a spokesman of the organization, but as far as I'm concerned, I have been of the opinion that we should have ended this war in January of this year and begun a process to get all of our hostages back and begin a whole different approach to what's going on. I do not believe that the use of force in an unlimited way for an unlimited amount of time would bring about the release of the hostages. And that's why the timing is basically connected also to the fact that there is no clear policy of what the Israeli government want to do in the day after situation. And no end is seen in sight. And in the meantime, Israeli soldiers are being killed. And this is something that we have to understand why this is happening. This is a burden on our society as well, not just on the Palestinian side, which, again, the pictures coming out of Gaza are not things that have contributed to our international standing. And again, we did not start this war in October 7th.
Yeah,
Ambassador, this is not a war we were looking for. And
if I could just ask you, you say that there's a lack of a plan for what happens when this war is over. Well, isn't that the responsibility of the current prime minister and his government? I mean, what you're describing sounds like a failure of leadership on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu.
I don't want to attribute various labels, but I believe the Israeli government should end the war, release the hostages, and also represent and produce a vision of how we have a political horizon of a political negotiation with the Palestinians. Not all Palestinians are Hamas. And there are a lot of moderate Palestinians that we need to engage, and we need to find a political settlement that will avoid any future October 7th and any future bloodshed. I think if we come out of this war without a political solution, then I do not understand why we have lost almost 2,000 Israeli soldiers and civilians. And that's why the government, the responsibility is also on the government. But don't forget, we have a very tough, brutal terror organization that we have to deal with. And that's why we need our friends now to help pressure with all the diplomatic pressure possible to get the hostages released.
Ambassador, we appreciate your time. We appreciate you taking the time to explain to the thinking behind this letter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now let's bring in Gershon Baskin. He's a former hostage negotiator as well as the Middle East director at the International Communities Organization. That's an NGO working in conflict zones with failed peace processes. He joins me now from Jerusalem. Gershon, we got this video and a letter from hundreds of former Israeli senior security officials. Let me read you a quote from it. They say, "It is our professional judgment that Hamas no longer poses a strategic threat to Israel. And our experience tells us that Israel has all it takes to deal with the residual terror capabilities remotely or otherwise. Chasing remaining senior Hamas operatives can be done later. Our hostages can't wait." What's your take when you hear these words?
100% correct. The only question I have to these people who I know very well is why has it taken them so long to say what's been true for about a year now? This war ended a long time ago. It should have ended a long time ago. There's no purpose strategically for Israel to continue it. The only purpose of the war today is to preserve the coalition of Benjamin Netanyahu and his own political life.
Now, these are not activists. These are serious professional ex-military and security people. Could such a letter coming from this group put pressure on Netanyahu to change course, you think?
Well, that's what they're hoping, but none of them have the delusion that Netanyahu is going to be influenced by them. There's only one person in the world who can influence Netanyahu and change the course of events regarding the war in Gaza, and that's President Trump. And he hasn't yet done that.
Now, you are very well connected and have many insights into how things work behind the scenes. How much is known about the remaining hostages in Gaza, the health conditions, where they are, or is this all unknown, like a black box to the Israeli government?
Well, we've seen these recent videos that show these survivors of the captivity who are skin and bones. They look like skeletons. They look very reminiscent of pictures of Jews who came out of the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. It's horrific to see them. It is believed that about 20 of the 50 hostages remaining in Gaza are alive. That number will be reduced in coming days and weeks if they remain in captivity. It is urgent to get them out as fast as possible. But I've been saying this since the very first week of the war, 22 months ago.
Now, you yourself are a former hostage negotiator. Please help us understand. Netanyahu reached out to the Red Cross to get food and medical assistance to the hostages in Gaza that are starving there. And the Red Cross said to us in an interview earlier that they would have always been ready to assist. Let's have a quick listen to a piece of that interview.
Since the first day of the escalation of this conflict, we have been in touch with both Israeli authorities and the Hamas authorities to discuss what we expect to happen, what needs to happen, things like our visits to hostages. We continue these discussions and we always remain ready to facilitate either the release and transfer of hostages out of Gaza or to visit them.
Now, what is then the issue here? Why can't the urgently needed aid reach the remaining hostages still alive? Why didn't that happen earlier?
Well, because Hamas is not a state actor. They're a non-state actor, and they're not seeing themselves obligated by international law, even though they quote international law. There's very little that can be done against them. Most of the international community already has sanctions on Hamas, and the territory that they held, Gaza, has been a territory under economic siege for 19, 20 years now. So there's very little leverage that the International Red Cross or anyone has on Hamas right now. Perhaps Egypt and Qatar have some leverage on Hamas, and they've been using that in the negotiations, in the mediation, in trying to reach a deal with Israel. Perhaps not hard enough, and certainly not fast enough, but there's very little that can be done to pressure a terrorist organization into honoring what international law, what states would be obligated to observe.
Now, Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Saar called for the international community to focus more on the hostage situation. Does he have a point?
Oh, he has a point that they should focus on it, but they can't do anything about it. Only Israel can make a deal with Hamas that's going to free the hostages. There is no military deal that can be done. None of the countries of the world have leverage on Hamas that can make them deliver the hostages. And Hamas is wanting an end to the war. If we want the hostages home, the war has to end. Israel has to withdraw from Gaza. Israel is going to have to release Palestinian prisoners from captivity in Israel. There are many, many Palestinians being held without trial that the Hamas consider them hostages as well. A deal has to be made to bring these hostages home, but it's going to require to end the war. And this is something that Prime Minister Netanyahu is still not ready to do.
Gershon Baskin there, the former hostage negotiator and Middle East Director of the International Communities Organization. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you.
All right, we're joined now by our correspondent, Emily Gordine. She's in Jerusalem. Emily, in this video and this letter from hundreds of former Israeli senior security officials, we've got part of the message here for our viewers to read with us. In that message, they say, "It is our professional judgment that Hamas no longer poses a strategic threat to Israel, and our experience tells us that Israel has all that it takes to deal with its residual terror capabilities, remotely or otherwise. Chasing remaining senior Hamas operatives can be done later. Our hostages can't wait. Strong statement there, Emily. Explain the political culture in Israel in which this is happening. I mean, how much influence do people like a former Mossad chief or ex-military officers, how much influence do they have?
Well, generally speaking, they are highly respected in Israeli society and as such wield significant influence over society. But by and large, the officials who have signed this letter and who appear in this video, they've been speaking out against this war for quite a while now, and they've been urging the government to reach some form of agreement with Hamas in this war to get the hostages out and to end this war permanently. And at the same time, of course, this statement when it comes to Israeli society is almost preaching to the choir, because many Israelis would like to see the end of the war and they would like to see the return of the hostages. It is this current Israeli government that so far has refused, or as we saw in March earlier this year, has opted out of a ceasefire deal that would have done exactly that, end the war and return the hostages.
Could a letter like the one we've seen today, could it put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to change course?
Well, this criticism isn't new to Netanyahu, and these are not the political figures he depends on. The people he does depend on are his coalition partners, such as Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, both of whom represent two parties in his government that are in favor of continuing this war. They want to ultimately relocate, as they've put it, Palestinians, which essentially comes to ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, and they want to see the resettlement of Gaza with Jews. And they've been very outspoken in their threats about leaving the government if Netanyahu decides to agree to any deal that would end the war. That's why a lot of critics of Netanyahu, including some of the signatories of this letter, have said that there's a continuation of this war. The fact that there is no end to the war has to do with the political survival of Netanyahu himself. The only person who does wield significant influence over Netanyahu when it comes to the war in Gaza is the US President Donald Trump, but so far he hasn't used that power to wield any significant influence on Netanyahu to end this war.
These former security officials also say, and I'm quoting here, "It is our professional assessment that Hamas is no longer poses a strategic threat to Israel." Now, you and I both know that is a fundamental change to Israeli policy that we have seen for years, for decades. How did these former security officials, how did they come to this conclusion?
Well, it has to do with several factors. On the one hand, Hamas's political and military leadership in Gaza has, by and large, been destroyed, has been dismantled over the course of this almost 2-year-long war. And then if you look at the partners that Hamas had in the region, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, but also with Iran, they too have been severely weakened by the Israeli military. And the IDF Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, has also said in recent weeks that the Israeli military is nearing the end of what it can actually do militarily in Gaza, and that is why he too has been calling for a political path out of this conflict. And that is essentially also what these former security officials are calling for, is essentially to translate these military achievements into political goals and to political achievements, which so far they don't appear in sight at all.
GW correspondent Emily Gordine with the latest from Jerusalem. Emily, as always, thank you.